Hello, and as promised, we are back with topic 3 of the Making of America, which is the Civil War and Reconstruction, which ranges from 1861 to 1877. So as in the last two videos, we have a key, and the second order concepts for this topic are very important just because there's so many. They're mainly about the significance, limitations, and diversity throughout the time period, and these are particularly evident in the Reconstruction topic. So I would recommend that you stay to the end of this video where we talk about exam tips and how to actually apply these second order concepts if you're asked about Reconstruction in an exam. And if you are asked about Reconstruction, then praise the Lord, praise the OCR examiners, because it's the best question you could get in my opinion. So the first subtopic is the divisions over slavery and the causes of the Civil War. And this slide is mainly just about facts that you need to learn. In 1861, the North part of America and the South went to war with each other, which is called the Civil War, as you probably know. It was fought between 1861 and 1865. The northern states were called the Union and the southern states were called the Confederacy. Not really anything juicy you can squeeze out this, just got to learn it. There were a lot of causes of the Civil War, and it was a consequence of a lot of political, economic, and social divisions. So for starters, the South thought that Northerners were too modern and ungodly, which is quite ironic, to be honest, because the Southerners were the ones holding enslaved people, but anyway. In 1850, the northern population was growing rapidly. Therefore, they had more power, meaning an increase in tensions because the North was making more money than the South, and America's all about money. If one part's making more than the other, then there's bound to be conflict and tension. As well as this, in 1854, there was a new act put in place called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This stated that states can now decide if they want to be a free or a slave state. And if you watched the previous videos, we talked about the Missouri Compromise and how that was an act that made sure there was a balance of power. So if a free state was added, a slave state would also have to be added, and vice versa. But this Kansas-Nebraska Act completely stepped over the Missouri Compromise. So an exam tip for you, if you're talking about the Missouri Compromise, it's worth mentioning that it's limited and not very significant because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which followed it. In 1854 as well, the Republican Party, which was the party against slavery, set up to demolish slavery. However, in 1857, the Supreme Court said that the US government could not ban slavery and that slaves had no rights. A consequence of this is that slaveholders had power, and tensions were steadily increasing because of this. A consequence of this ruling from the Supreme Court was that in 1859, an abolitionist called John Brown tried to start a slave uprising, but he unfortunately failed. That's just a nice little fact you can add into some of your essays. You don't have to mull over that too much. But a huge turning point in the African American experience and the causes of the Civil War was in 1860 when a man named Abraham Lincoln became president. And we'll see why later. So, as we've just said, the election of Lincoln was one of the triggers which ultimately led to the Civil War. He had practically no support from the South because he didn't support slavery. Something that's really important to remember is that Abraham Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist who thought slavery was morally wrong. He wasn't a nice person. He wanted a balance of power. He was from the North. He didn't want the South to get too powerful because he, as everyone else in America, was money-oriented. So that's why he didn't like slavery, because the South were benefiting more from it than the North. So just make that concrete in your mind. He wasn't a good person. In November 1860, out of defiance for this election, South Carolina, a southern Confederate state, voted to leave the USA in protest. This had a knock-on effect, and more states followed to join the Confederacy. The Confederacy then elected Jefferson Davis to be their leader. He then ordered an open fire at a place called Fort Sumter in 1861. That's quite important, you should remember that. Because of this, Lincoln then declared a war. So it was a war between the Union and the Confederacy, the North and the South. So the next subtopic is about the African American experience of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Something that's really important to remember is that the North was not a good place for Black people. They still had very limited rights, but it's the fact that they had none at all in the South which made the northern part of America better for enslaved people. So in the North, the jobs available for Black people were not fairly paid compared to their white co-workers, and they could not be in positions where they would be in charge of white people. The housing, they lived in poor areas with high rents, they had segregated schools, so they struggled to get jobs in the North. In the South, it was quite similar. Most slaves couldn't get jobs. There was no separate housing except for plantations, which carried a lot of disease. It was very unsanitary. In terms of education, it was illegal to learn to read or write. So in that sense, it was quite different from the North, because at least in the North, you had the opportunity to get some kind of education. A significant change was the end of slavery in the South. A significant change for the African American experience, that is. So in 1861 to 1862, some land in South Carolina was given to ex-slaves. Missionaries taught ex-slaves how to read and write. The Union refused to commit to complete abolition of slavery, so some had to do some hard labour. This was a kind of step forward for ex-enslaved people, because they were given some land, they were given some education, but letting go of slavery completely was a big step for the Union Army, and they weren't quite comfortable with that. So they still were forced to do some kind of slavery. But a huge turning point, which you should remember, is in 1863, there was a law called the Emancipation Proclamation, and this banned slavery in the South. This meant that ex-slaves could become barbers, mechanics. Slaves in the Deep South were given 40 acres of land. Ex-slaves then fled from the South and joined the Union Army to fight against the Confederacy. But a setback, Black soldiers had the worst jobs. Some of them even kept working on plantations, so you could argue that it was quite limited, this Emancipation Proclamation, and get your second order concepts in. Another limitation was that this law was not in full effect until after the Civil War, so it wasn't an immediate change. Black Americans in the North suffered the usual racism. There were signs of some slight improvement. So here's a kind of timeline for you. In 1861, Black people were not allowed to join the Union Army. And a consequence of this was that there were a lot of race riots, because white people were angry that they were being forced to fight, and they blamed this on Black people, because they wanted Black people to risk their lives and not the valuable white people, as I say in quotation marks. In 1863, there was a diversity, a change in the time period. Black people were allowed to join the Union Army, but but this was followed by even more race riots because not many black people even wanted to volunteer to fight because they could much easily get jobs at home whilst the white people were fighting. But in 1864, black people were allowed to have equal pay, but they couldn't be officers. So I guess you could say there was some improvement, certainly between 1861 to 1864, but still the usual racism was still apparent. Okay, now this is probably the juiciest topic in the whole of America. It's Reconstruction after the Civil War and its impact on black Americans from 1863 to 1877. The reason why I say this is because it was mayhem, basically. You went from progress to limitation to progress again, just round in circles. It's such a good place to talk about your second order concepts. So, without further ado, before the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln took steps to reboot the USA to make it fit for ex-enslaved people. In 1865, he passed the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves in the South. He then started the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a charity for black people. It gave confiscated land to ex-slaves, it gave them more agency and power. He also wanted to make sure that black people could not be prevented from becoming citizens. We'll see how you can talk about diversity later, but this is very useful to talk about in an exam because later on in the time period, they were blocked from being citizens and it was hard for them to vote, but we'll look more on that later. The reason why I've highlighted this title in pink is because it was such a setback for black Americans. It's this period called presidential Reconstruction, and it was really, really bad. This happened after Abraham Lincoln died, after he was assassinated in 1865. A man named Andrew Johnson, he was a really mean man, bad man. He was the new president. He was the vice president before. He was against the Union. He was a Confederate person. He stopped the Freedmen's Bureau. He shut it down. He also allowed southern states to be re-established into their state government. Now, this is highlighted in yellow because it's useful to talk about in your exam. It's also highlighted in red text because there's a second order concept you can talk about here. When Abraham Lincoln was in charge, he obviously took away the state government in the southern states as a punishment, but now all of a sudden that power is being given back to them. So that's a huge, just drastic change with a huge diversity in the time period. It really set black people back because it was as if the Southerners had no punishment if they were just allowed to gain their power like that. Black codes, which were a list of really heavily restricting laws for black people, were introduced. Stuff like segregation, unequal pay, lynching. Andrew Johnson also did very little to stop the KKK, which was an anti-black clan of white supremacists who would lynch, hang, kill black people just in broad daylight and hang them from trees. Really vile stuff. He allowed all of the Confederate states to rejoin the USA, even though some of them voted against the 13th Amendment. So even though these people didn't want slaves to be free, they were allowed to rejoin the USA, which again is another setback after Abraham Lincoln had just banned them from the USA. So it's like a uno reverso basically. He also pardoned Confederate soldiers and he returned land from the Sea Islands back to them. So land that was given to ex-enslaved people under Abraham Lincoln's rule was stripped away from them, given back to the Southerners. So it's just this, every act that Abraham Lincoln had put in place was effectively just really insignificant and limited because of this period of presidential reconstruction. And it's such a juicy thing to talk about in your exams. But not all hope is lost, because we have this really amazing period called Radical Reconstruction. These were steps taken by a group of people called the Radical Republicans, which you would have learnt about in your lessons, who had had enough of presidential reconstructions. They were very angry at Andrew Johnson. They wanted even more change. However, there's always an however. This was extremely limited, and we'll see why in a bit. In February 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau was reintroduced, but it was limited, and we'll see later in the next slide. Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill, and this protected rights of Black Americans. Again, limited, and we'll see later. The 14th Amendment was introduced. This allowed anyone to be a citizen, and you know the drill. We'll get to why this is limited later. In 1867, the ex-Confederate governments were banned, and the people who fought against the Union Army were banned from voting, which was a positive. At least there's one positive. In 1867, again, the soldiers were stationed in the South to protect the rights of Black people at voting booths, so they couldn't be prevented from voting by being bullied out of the voting booths. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was introduced, meaning that anyone can vote. Black people now have the right to vote. They've got the protection of the army stationed in the South. Ex-Confederate governments were banned. It was all looking good. And you've got the Civil Rights Bill and the 14th Amendment, but that's a bit hazy there, and we'll see why. However, not everyone was happy about Reconstruction, and I'm sure we can guess who. It was the South. Not just the South, though. There were also people in the North who moved to the South to make money out of Radical Reconstruction, and these people were called carpetbaggers. They basically took advantage of the amount of money that could be made and just didn't listen to what their side was saying. They just disbanded from their argument completely. In the mid-1870s, people started to begin to think that Reconstruction was a mistake in the North and the South. So even people in the North were kind of regretting their actions now. White business owners grew very rich out of Reconstruction because they took large profit from the factories that were built to support Black people. After 1870, many of the radical changes were reversed, and this is where we look back at this slide and they just contradict each other. So in 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was shut down, completely, right after it had been opened in 1866. In 1873, the Supreme Court said that voting rights were the choice of the state, which contrasts to the Civil Rights Bill, because the right to vote was being stripped away from them following the 15th Amendment as well. So there's another diversity. In 1875, the Supreme Court said that the protection at booths was not their responsibility, which again, another diversity, because soldiers were stationed in the South to protect the rights of Black Americans in voting booths. To compound this, in 1877, the government withdrew the soldiers in the South after the war, which is, once again, another diversity, because they were only just introduced in 1867. So as you can see, this slide is just the complete opposite of this slide, which means you can talk so much about limitations and diversity and significance, and it's just a really, really juicy topic. So, as we get to our last slide, I thought it would be fitting if we did a little review on the second order concepts and the exam techniques. So, the topic of Reconstruction is just jam-packed with opportunities to talk about second order concepts, especially diversity, significance, and limitations. For example, slide 9, which is, I believe, if we just go back, slide 9 directly contrasts with slide 10, which is this one, with regard to the Freedmen's Bureau and the ex-Confederate soldiers. If you begin talking about the content from slide 11 and 13, as we've just kind of glossed over, it's going to guarantee you marks in your exams, because you're going to be naturally talking about second order concepts without even saying diversity, limitation, significance. That's because all of these protections and laws were just reversed, meaning you can mention that diversity through the time period really gracefully, sophisticatedly. So if you get a question about Reconstruction, thank OCR, thank God, thank anything, because you're guaranteed a high mark if you watch this video and the rest of them and you focus on your second order concepts. So that's it for Civil War and Reconstruction. Quite a longer video, about 22 minutes. The next video will be on topic 4. That will be uploaded tomorrow. Make sure you come back to check that video out if you're interested.